Okay, well, we are in that little section that I'm calling the New Covenant Acknowledged, really the identity of Christ himself acknowledged. First of all, by the high priest, his prosecutor, you're the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One. And now, just to make it more interesting, Pilate. So, you're the King of the Jews. All of these are simply statements which ironically become the best testimony we have of the true identity of Christ from human witnesses coming from his enemies. This section we've seen the Messiah alone. All of you are going to forsake me. Agonizing. The Garden of Gethsemane. Arrested. Betrayed by Judas with a kiss. Arraigned. We just were looking at that. Abandoned by Peter when he denies any knowledge of Christ, and now accused as they've come before Pilate with what they believe is a capital crime. Jesus has committed blasphemy. He's claimed to be the Son of God, making himself equal with God, and that in their minds justifies and warrants that he be hauled in front of Pilate. So it takes place early in the morning after a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council, that is the Sanhedrin. They bring Jesus, led him away, delivered him to Pilate. We're assuming that by now it's probably 5 or 6 in the morning. The consultation with the entire council tells us it was not the entire council that was there in the lower levels of the home of Caiaphas during this overnight arraignment. But now there's going to be a gathering with all of these who are the religious elite, the religious leaders in Jerusalem. The council that gathered would have been expected to do so early in the morning. They weren't summoned for this purpose, but this was a holy day. This was the Passover day, and these are people, many of whom would have important duties throughout the unfolding events, celebration of Passover. And it would be typical and expected that they would all gather very early in the morning to kind of get things all straightened out, who's going to be where, who's going to be doing what, you know. When we celebrate communion in this church, the elders get together, have a little powwow, work out the details. Well, they're doing this kind of in a bigger way. They don't know that the first item of business is going to be Jesus of Nazareth. The arrest of Jesus took place precipitously and in some ways unexpectedly. The high priest thought they were going to have to wait until after the Passover celebration, the Feast of Unleavened Bread and all of that, maybe a week or so. And then they grab Jesus and deal with him. But now Judas helps out. And so, unexpectedly, they can nab him right in the middle of the night. They can deal with these matters in a kind of quick, precipitous way. They can put the case to the Sanhedrin early in the morning. Hey guys, the guy committed blasphemy. He claimed to be the Son of God. What do you think? Well, they haven't had a lot of time to reflect on this. Most of them are pretty hostile toward Jesus anyway. That's all they need. And so, from this point of view, they simply affirm, rubber stamp, what this subcommittee has worked out overnight. Of course, all of this is in striking inconsistency with Jewish due process. Jewish laws specifically forbid sentencing a person on the day of their trial in a capital case. In Jesus' case, he was not only arrested, he was tried, he was sentenced, and indeed executed, all within less than a day, maybe more of a half a day. And so, Jesus, having committed the crime as they see it, is hauled off to a character known to us as Pilate. This is not necessarily a correct representation of his image. We don't know what he looked like. Nobody was there to snap his photo. My students used to give me a bad time that I was so old I should have been there, but nevertheless, I missed that one. So here is Pilate. Pilate is one of the most famous people and one of those famous names, as you know, in the history of the world. His name has been said by people, including all of us in this room, many times. His name in history has probably been said by people billions upon billions of times. I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord. who was conceived of the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, what? Suffered under Pontius Pilate. And again, his name is remembered. Had Pontius Pilate not had this brief encounter with Jesus of Nazareth, only the most nerdy people who are obsessed with ancient history and the details of it would have ever heard his name. But it was that encounter, because where Jesus went and the people he touched and the places he visited became, from that point on, important to us. And so Pontius Pilate, who otherwise just would have been an obscure bureaucrat of no great interest, becomes this character in whom we take some high degree of interest. There was a time when people actually doubted there ever was a Pontius Pilate. People have tried to make the whole story of Jesus a fabrication, but we know there was. He's mentioned by Josephus, he's mentioned by Philo, and in fact in 1961 we actually found a kind of slate tablet that was dug out of the ground. I know you can't read that, but trust me, what it says roughly is something like Pontius Pilate appointed by Tiberius, serving as the prefect in Judea. So we have pretty good external evidence that this guy was there, even though that late discovery came more later than we might have expected. Who is he? It's interesting that Mark treats him rather politely. If you read Mark and even all of the other gospel accounts, they give mixed messages about Pontius Pilate, but generally you'd have to say Mark treats Pilate not as a virtuous man, but certainly as a man who is at least thinking about trying to do the right thing here. Some have thought maybe Mark is trying to deflect blame from Rome. The people to whom he's writing are obviously facing Roman persecution. Maybe Mark's trying to prevent exacerbating Roman sentiments against them, not unnecessarily at least. Dr. Jim Edwards is not so sure. I was just talking with Jim a couple of minutes ago here. I thought he might wander in so I could make sure he gets due credit. But he, in his commentary on that very point, says, quote, we would scarcely expect Mark, who was just shown that bearing faithful witness under persecution is a mark of true discipleship, to deny his own lesson by misrepresenting Pilate in order to avert the possible consequences of suffering for the sake of the gospel. So Jim thinks, well, Mark may be treating him politely, but nevertheless, in the greater scheme of things, Mark is probably not any great fan of Pontius Pilate. At least on the face of it, the case against Pilate in terms of his role in the trial and persecution of Jesus is pretty significant. Crucifixion itself, as you're well aware, was a Roman form of execution. The Jewish people would stone people for capital offenses. Roman military were at least apparently present at the time of Jesus' arrest. John tells us that, not Mark. But the fact that Roman military were there, if they were, which John says they were, would suggest that Pilate had some understanding of what was going on. He was the guy who was mainly in charge of Roman authority in that place at that time. The pace of events, the fact that Jesus is arrested and then is brought before Pilate, and so quickly all of these matters are handled, suggests that there may have even been some kind of collusion. The fact that Pontius Pilate is aware of this charge, King of the Jews, which would be the most interesting charge from his point of view, and that's the first thing that he puts to Jesus, once again suggests, Jim says, that Pilate was neither uninformed nor an unwilling accomplice in the matters that were proceeding at this point. So I'll leave it to your own judgment how you want to assess him, but at least there's been some concern that maybe Pilate was more of a player in this process than many people would suspect simply from the New Testament text itself. Pontius Pilate was a prefect. It's the term, it'd be something like a governor. You may recall that Archelaus, who was the son of Herod the Great, was deposed by the Romans in 6 AD. So he leaves the picture, and from that point on, there is no king as such in Judah. Rather, Rome simply unilaterally appointed bureaucrats, governors, who would serve in that role As it turns out, Pontius Pilate was the fifth of 14 of them who held that post until Jerusalem was eventually destroyed in 70 AD. His title is also called a procurator. The root of the word procurator is procure, because it was the responsibility of the procurator to procure revenue and ship it off to Rome. And so in some ways you might say Pontius Pilate was just simply a big deal tax collector. That's what he was there to do, to make sure that the revenue was flowing and not being interrupted by any local difficulties. Pontius Pilate served between the years 26 and 37, right through the time that we're interested in at this point. He was a reasonably competent governor. That was the longest term that anybody served in that post, and suggests that there was a certain degree of stability in connection with his rule in that area. His residence was in Caesarea Maritima, which was over on the coast, a city that had been lavishly refurbished by Herod the Great. He'd created kind of water world down on the Mediterranean shore there in Caesarea Maritima, and parts of the city were very lavish and very nice, and so that's where Pontius Pilate lived his private life during this time. But he would always go to Jerusalem whenever there were going to be major festivities or holidays or other incidents which could suggest a swelling of the population and maybe somewhat more important events taking place. So he was in Jerusalem for the festival of Passover, but that wasn't his normal hangout. When he was in Jerusalem, he stayed at the palace that had been built by Herod, another rather lavish facility. That's where the praetorium was housed, and that's where Pontius Pilate was clearly at the time of the encounter he has with Jesus of Nazareth. What's his character? He's generally described by sources outside the New Testament as competent but stubborn, which probably is exactly what he was. I imagine that if you met him, that would be the thing that you would be impressed with. There are several incidents concerning Pontius Pilate we hear of not from the New Testament but from other sources. Josephus, for example, tells us that on one occasion, Pontius Pilate, early in his career there, wanted to really make it clear that Rome was in charge, and he put up some emblems of that, symbols of Roman authority, at the entrance of the temple. So as people were going into the temple area to worship, they were immediately encountering these images standing for Roman rule. And they didn't like that, because that violated the Jewish sensibilities that were hostile to graven images. And so these people began to protest to Pontius Pilate that this was highly offensive to their religious outlook, and Pontius Pilate said, who cares? You know, those emblems are there, they're going to stay there, so get over it. Well, after a fairly brief period of time, a goodly number of Jewish people actually made the trek from Jerusalem to Caesarea Maritima and assembled, a fairly large number of them, in front of the private residence of Pontius Pilate. They weren't being violent, they weren't trying to call for some sort of revolution or overthrow, but they were standing there in a kind of silent vigil, trying to put pressure on Pontius Pilate to change his policies. Finally, about 5 days into this, Pontius Pilate went out on the front porch and said, look, people, I'm not going to change my practice, and if you folks don't disperse, I'm going to unleash a few Roman soldiers, and there's going to be some blood in the streets. Pontius Pilate thought that would do the trick. He was shocked when these Jewish people fell down on their knees, grabbed themselves by the collars of their clothing, pulled it back, exposed their necks, and because they would rather have their necks cut than relent in the protests they were making. Even Pontius Pilate caved on that one. He couldn't believe it, and so he in fact bowed to public sentiment and remove those images. The outcome wasn't quite so happy in another incident. The fresh water in Jerusalem was a rather scarce commodity, and so Pontius Pilate saw to it that there was an aqueduct constructed 23 miles long But to finance it, he took money from the temple treasury. The people didn't mind the fresh water, but they thought that was an abuse of the money that had been donated in the temple. And so once again, they protested, this time somewhat more vigorously. And as a result of that, Pontius Pilate did unleash some Roman soldiers against them. They actually were more destructive than he himself had wanted. There were quite a few people killed. More were killed in the trampling of the melee that followed from it. And so at least on one occasion, he had a certain degree of bloodshed as a result of his policies. In the book of Luke, chapter 13, we hear of an incident, we don't hear of it elsewhere, in which Pilate was said to have mixed the blood of worshipers with the blood of their sacrifices. Best guess is there were some Galileans who had come down to Jerusalem to worship. They'd probably brought with them their sacrificial animals. Somehow or other they had offended Pilate, and as a result of that, he'd actually slain them, and in a kind of sort of sacrilegious act, mixed their blood with the blood of their sacrifices and offered it there, or had it offered in the temple. The reason or the backstory for that remains somewhat obscure. The thing that led to the end of his term was that there was an uprising in Samaria. And as a result, Pontius Pilate unleashed Roman forces who put down the rebellion with such brutality, going really way beyond the proportions of what was necessary, that word got back to folks in Rome that he was apparently just out of control, and he was sacked. This was in the first year of the reign of Caligula, who was no paragon of virtue himself, and so it makes you wonder, but he was actually fired by someone that served under Caligula. And so in the year 37, the first year of Caligula's reign, we've come to the end of the tour of Pontius Pilate in Judea. The summary that Jim gives here, I think, is pretty close to the point. Pilate appears to have been a rather typical appointee of the Emperor Tiberius, and the dogged qualities that procured the governorship for him in the first place were the same ones that eventuated in his losing it. So he passes off into the pages of history. There's been some tradition associated with Pilate that he died by suicide. Christian sentiments have wanted to believe he died by suicide over remorse in connection with his dealings with Jesus of Nazareth. That's a possibility, not a probability. Death by suicide among people who served in the Roman world and the Roman culture was not altogether uncommon. In fact, in some ways it was viewed as a rather virtuous way to go. The Stoic philosophy of the day viewed death with a certain amount of disdain, and there was a kind of philosophy that when you reach a certain point in life, that may just be the thing that shows that, it's time to move on to whatever's next. And so death by suicide in the case of Pontius Pilate or many others may or may not have anything to do with remorse related to the life you've lived. But be that as it may, at least there's a tradition associated with Pilate to that effect. In the New Testament, we find that the description of Pilate is pretty consistent with what is otherwise known about him. He's a man who was a politician, and he seems to deal with events based more on political calculation rather than principle, and I think what happens with Jesus is probably a good case in point. When commentators said, judging Jesus to be unworthy either of a stand on principle or a show of force, Pilate opts to stand down, thus consigning Jesus to a routine crucifixion. Sometimes the question comes up, why didn't the Sanhedrin just execute Jesus themselves? Of course, it's well known they didn't have the authority to do that. Roman presence required that capital cases requiring execution take place with the imprimatur of Rome, but it's also well known that the Sanhedrin disregarded that rule constantly. They stoned Stephen outside the walls of Jerusalem. They had James the Just put to death, and we have good reason to believe that the Sanhedrin was responsible for many other executions on its own actions, on its own authorities, and what they got for it was just a slap on the wrist. It wasn't like anybody was in a whole lot of trouble for that. And so why was Jesus brought to Pilate, why didn't they just dispatch him in the middle of the night? Why did they require the Roman stamp of approval on this thing through Pilate? It may be that they were concerned of the growing popularity of Jesus. By this time, he's got quite a popular following in Jerusalem. Maybe they want to chill that a little bit by making sure that people understand that Rome was behind this execution, as well as the religious leaders in Jerusalem. Maybe they wanted to scandalize the reputation of Jesus with the stigma of crucifixion. There's hardly any form of execution known to the human race that is more profoundly scandalous and shameful, ignominious than death by crucifixion. It took place routinely with a person being naked, hung out there on a cross in excruciating pain, subjected to the most unbelievable forms of ridicule and mockery. It's hard to imagine something any more ghastly than death by crucifixion. And maybe these religious leaders hoped that death by crucifixion would simply attach such a stigma to Jesus that people would simply be nauseated by it and turn away from it. The Apostle Paul certainly seems to understand that when he says, the preaching of the cross is to those who are perishing foolishness. It's the foolishness of this world. To the Greeks, it's an offense. To the Romans, it was just a scandal. To the Jewish people, it was an insult because it was such a show of weakness. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul details all of that. And so, at least to some degree, you'd say they were successful in that strategy. And yet, in the greater scheme of things, there's no more famous symbol of the Christian movement than the cross, you know. Maybe they were trying to turn a religious problem into a political one. Jesus was fundamentally, at this point, a religious problem, challenging the religious prestige of these leaders. And if they can make it more of a political problem, make it more Pilate's issue than theirs, then that might, in fact, accomplish it. Well, one way or another, they wanted Pilate on board, and so they bring Jesus to Pilate, and Jesus asks, "Are you the king of the Jews?" To which Jesus responds, "It is as you say." Translated that way, not quite what he said. This was the charge that would have been of greatest interest to Pilate. It's a political claim to be the king of the Jews. It's another leading question. Caiaphas had asked earlier, "You're the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One." It's a statement, a leading question, you know. Same thing here. It reads basically, "So, you're the king of the Jews." There's a subtlety to it. You have to work with me here, because I will grant at the outset I'm working a little bit on a kind of speculative level, but Pilate is a politician, and politicians always have to have this rather strange relationship with the people that they are governing. They have to have authority over them and yet maintain a kind of support by them. Even Pontius Pilate had to have political concerns in mind. He didn't like Jewish authority much. It could be powerful enough to challenge him. He knew popular interest in Jerusalem was not always on the same page with the religious authority. He knew that those were two kind of competing interests. And Pilate, really for his own interest, his own purpose, would like to keep those two more or less at each other's throats. That takes the focus off of Pilate and keeps his position somewhat more secure if he can have popular sentiment more or less hostile to the religious leaders and vice versa. And so, in a sense, there is in this question not simply a question to Jesus, but there's a little bit of a slap in the face to the religious leaders. And if you can kind of hear it with this tone of voice, Pilate looks at Jesus and says, "So, you're the king of the Jews." As if to say, this is the best these folks can come up with. This is the only king that these people are actually able to gin up. "Oh, you're the king of the Jews." You know, it's kind of that deal. It's not so much insulting Jesus as the people who've brought Jesus on the claim that he's making to be king of the Jews, Messiah, this sort of thing. So there's a little bit of a hint, you might say, of a slap at the Sanhedrin in putting it just that way. He's sarcastic, and he's directing his sarcasm more at these with whom he has a somewhat tense relationship anyway. Jesus' response is interesting. The Greek here is suleges. The word su is the second person singular, you. The verb leges means you say. So even without the su there, it would mean you say this. The addition of it makes it emphatic. So, Pilate says, so, you're the king of the Jews. And Jesus says, you say so, you see. And that little subtlety is very interesting as the story unfolds. Well, meantime, the chief priests are accusing him of many things. One person called this a cacophony of slander that's being issued forth. Of course, Jesus answers nothing, obeying his own precept. We alluded to that last week. And finally, Pilate, surprised, asked him again, do you answer nothing? Look at all these things these people are testifying against you. But Jesus doesn't do what Pilate fully expected him to do. This is undoubtedly the only time Pilate ever met Jesus directly. This is their only interaction. Pilate has dealt with accused criminals many times. He's dealt with people facing death by execution, by crucifixion many times. He's accustomed to people groveling, begging, crying out for mercy, engaged in all kinds of justification. I'm being falsely accused this, I didn't do that, and that kind of thing. And here's Jesus standing in a most extraordinary display of self-possession, not engaging in self-defense, not engaging in self-justification. He's outdoing the best of the Stoics as he's standing there with his perfect equanimity in the presence of all of this, and even Pilate is a bit moved by it. As Jesus answered nothing, Pilate marveled, and you almost think maybe Pilate's taking another look at this guy, that there's a little bit of loosening of his own mortar here as he sees something about Jesus that certainly doesn't fit his expectation. One said, the silence of a blameless life pleads more powerfully than any defense, however elaborate. It was at this point that, according to Luke, Pilate sent Jesus to Herod Agrippa. Mark isn't interested in that, so he skips by it. He's telling his story a certain way to make a certain point. But Luke, giving us a little bit more detail, mentions that. Herod Agrippa was the son also of Herod the Great. He was in Jerusalem for the Passover, so even though he reigned in Galilee, he's here. It had come out in this discussion that Jesus was from Galilee, and thus Pilate, now a little bit uneasy about what's going on, thinks, well, maybe he can just dodge this bullet and send Jesus to Herod Agrippa, have Herod deal with it. This is that famous moment, of course, when Jesus shows up with Herod Agrippa. Herod earlier had been concerned about Jesus, thinking he was John the Baptist, risen from the dead. You recall that. He thought, Jesus was John the Baptist coming back to haunt him because Herod had executed John the Baptist in prison. You recall that story from earlier in Mark. Well, apparently Herod had gotten over his superstitions, and now he's happy to see Jesus. He's heard Jesus is a miracle worker. He wants Jesus to pull a rabbit out of a hat. He wants him to do a magic trick, He wants some entertainment. He expects Jesus maybe will make good on the reputation he has of being able to do these powerful deeds. And so Herod is asking him to display his stuff in this setting. And of course, Jesus is unresponsive, doesn't say a word. The moment is captured in that rock musical, Jesus Christ Superstar, when Herod says to Jesus, show the world that you're no fool, walk across my swimming pool. And that, I don't recommend that musical, but that's a great line from it. And I think that probably is pretty faithful to the spirit of what's going on. Herod is he's probably been partying all night, and he's 3 sheets to the wind, and this is not a serious encounter. And Jesus doesn't dignify the moment by saying one word. All right, well, back he goes to Pilate. Now at the festival, he used to release a prisoner for them, anyone for whom they asked. There was a man called Barabbas in prison with the rebels who had committed murder during the insurrection. So the crowd came and began to ask Pilate to do for them according to his custom. Then he answered them, the crowd, well, do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews? For he realized that it was out of envy that the chief priests had handed him over. Pilate knows what's going on here. So there is a custom. We don't know of this custom from any source outside the New Testament. It took place during the Feast of Passover, and the custom was that one prisoner, probably a political prisoner, maybe a popular political figure who had been arrested for some reason or other, would be released. It was a way for Pilate to throw a bone to popular sentiment, you see. And again, it was not necessarily something the Sanhedrin would want, but something the more popular culture would desire, and so it was a way of him keeping this balancing act going on. Well, the guy who was on the short list to be released was a fellow named Barabbas. He was chained with his fellow rebels, and they had committed murder in the rebellion. I don't know how many sermons in church history have been preached on this, but I imagine it's quite a few, noting that the name Barabbas means Bar Abba, son of a father. Son of a father. And so what you have is this very ironic situation where a son of a father is going to be replaced by the son of the father. And that has always been an interesting little subtlety in the story, hidden in the name Barabbas. He's said to have committed murder in the rebellion. We don't know anything more about him than that. We don't know which rebellion is being referred to, but apparently Mark's audience did, because it's referred to as the rebellion. Nevertheless, Josephus tells us that revolts were common, and that whatever the rebellion was, there were certainly plenty of candidates out there to fit the bill of what's described here. Well, this is the one Pilate thought they would ask for. Remember, the crowd doesn't know what's happened either. This has all happened in the middle of the night, so they're coming to Pilate not having anything to do with Jesus. They're just coming to demand once again that he do what he's done in past years and release to them. And they probably came with Barabbas on their minds. That seems to be Pilate's expectation. It seems to be what they were actually anticipating. Pilate's hoping he can do a little bait and switch here. He's hoping that because Jesus is popular, he can once again kind of slap the Sanhedrin in the face by throwing another bone to the popular folks and giving them this guy who is popular. He doesn't think Jesus is all that much of a threat. I mean, look at this. You know, this is not any kind of political rabble-rouser. And yeah, I think Pilate is at this point figuring, why not? Why not please the people? Get one up on the Sanhedrin, and so he's got this little plot brewing. The multitude comes. They begin asking Pilate to do what he's done in the past, to release someone to them. The phrase crying aloud in Greek can also mean going up. It simply suggests that they're coming to his residence and they're making this demand, and they want him to do what they've done in the past. So Pilate now, maybe expecting that they'll be surprised by this, brings out this one who is popularly called by some people the King of the Jews, playing to the crowd against the Jewish leaders who want Jesus crucified. Pilate turns to them, knowing that Jesus was popular, assuming that he's otherwise harmless, and makes the offer. But again, you have to say, bottom line, what Pilate is doing here has no particular interest in justice, just a kind of political game, even for him at this moment, when he appears to be the most heroic. One said, instead of being a voice, he became an echo. Such action brings life down from every moral and spiritual height to the level of the lowest common denominator of mass opinion. The question is not what is being said this year, but what has God said in all the years? Much bigger question. Nobody's really asking that one at this moment. Pilate knew that the chief priests had handed Jesus over because of envy. He knew what was going on. He knew these religious leaders loved the applause of the crowd. They loved the prestige of being regarded as the most elite religious spirits within, hundreds of miles of that location. And all of a sudden, here comes Jesus, and he breaks the curve. His virtue so far exceeds that of the most religious, most virtuous among them, that it becomes no contest in the popular minds. That has been the effect of Jesus. I don't know if you had this experience. Occasionally I was in classes where some smart kid broke the curve. How much is that kid loved by the rest of the class? You ever notice that? You know, they can be subjected to some pretty significant abuse as a result of that. And Jesus becomes the most great curve breaker in history, especially with respect to these guys and in their envy. That Jesus is actually getting more points for popularity than they want him dispatched. They want him gone. And Pilate knew that. Pilate knew that the religious leaders also had a kind of precarious, symbiotic relationship with the people. They wanted to lord it over them and yet desperately needed them. And all of that in Pilate's mind probably became the basis for this chess game that he's playing at this point. So he hopes to use Jesus as a pawn, undermining the leaders while doing a favor for the crowd. That's what's in his mind, but it doesn't quite work out as he had hoped. The chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas for them instead. Pilate spoke to them again, to the crowd. Well, what do you want me to do with the man you call the King of the Jews? And they shouted back, crucify him. Pilate asked, why? What has he done? And they shouted all the more, crucify him. So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, this wasn't what he expected would be the way to do that, but had to do something. Released Barabbas, handed Jesus over for a flogging and to be crucified. We don't know quite how the chief priests got to the people, but somehow they stirred up the crowd. The word that's used there by Mark could mean aroused, incited, or agitated the people. I think probably Pilate was surprised at this. I think he assumed Jesus was popular and that at this point they would go for Jesus over Barabbas. And so he's a little bit flummoxed when his own, what he thought was a pretty smart strategy, rather blows up in his face. The Jerusalem crowd is described by many, especially Josephus, as having a kind of riotous and fickle disposition, ready for violence, ready for bloodshed. And so they might have been easy game for the religious leaders. One said, the same forces that led to the crucifixion of Jesus are with us now. Pride, lifeless tradition, prejudice, blind emotion leads to an unspeakable violence and injustice every day of the year, somewhere. How did they manipulate the crowd? Well, I think at least one possibility is the religious leaders are appealing to the crowd on the premise of practical politics rather than principled policy. I like this comment. We always have a Barabbas with us. He's a nationalist, an intense patriot. He was a man of violence, no sentimental nonsense about loving one's enemies. He replaced brains with muscle. He was a realist. He viewed evil as external. Just get rid of that political party. Get rid of those Republicans. Get rid of those Democrats. Get rid of this guy, that person. And we'll have utopia. Naive, but very common. Just get rid of them. And this commentator says we're still facing the same question today, Barabbas or Jesus? Well, Pilate, now obviously a little surprised and apparently a little desperate, says, well, what do you want? You know, not talking to the Sanhedrin, he knows what they want. Talking to the crowd, well, what do you want me to do with this man you call the King of the Jews? So he's playing to their emotions, trying to reach their loyalties. What do you want me to do? And he gives rise to this famous Ecce Homo painting. You've all seen it. This is before Jesus has been flogged, so the accuracy is pretty correct here. What do you want me to do with this man? One said, this is the inescapable question about the unavoidable Christ. You can't get away from it. He's standing in front of you. The crowd wanted to destroy him, and Pilate caved. We do the same thing when we but patronize Jesus rather than truly taking him seriously. We can praise him the way one would praise a drawing by a 6-year-old child. We can ignore him. We can blot him out of our lives as though he never lived. We cannot, however, not do anything. And there he is. Well, the crowd there that day cried out, "Crucify him." Mark puts it in an intense way. They cried out exceedingly, would be a way of rendering it. Pilate, increasingly desperate. Why? What evil has he done? What's the crime this man has committed? And of course, this is not a reasoned discussion. The question of Pilate is only met by louder shouting, "Crucify him." So Pilate now is really reaching the end of his tether and really the end of his options. It's a mark, I don't need to tell you, of degenerating public discourse when a discussion devolves to who can outshout the other side, and I'm afraid a lot of what passes for political conversation in our culture has simply been who has the loudest voice and who can shout the longest till the other side wilts. Well, that particular political strategy has been with us a long time, and it seems to be what was going on the occasion of Jesus in front of this crowd. It's a sad day when shouting becomes a substitute for thinking, says one comment. This is a reversion to a lower type of animal life. Aristotle, you may recall, celebrated in his famous work on politics the fact that we, of all of the species of creatures on this planet, would solve our difficulties by conversation, by words. And he makes his whole philosophy orbit around the importance of words. He recognizes something quite biblical, that it's human beings that have this power of speech, and what a great gift it is that we are able to communicate by words, which makes the opening verses of the Gospel of John, "In the beginning was the Word, and this Word became flesh and dwelt among us." And the whole significance of human words, in a sense, is to bring us to the fundamental truth of the Word. But when we lose touch with our human dignity, we fall back to a kind of animal level, of communicating with grunts and snorts and snarls and shouts and nothing much that really resembles reason. What evil has he done? Pilate asks the question. When an unexamined prejudice gets lodged in our mind, an attack is inevitably met with not with reason, but with shouting, and here they shouted all the more. Well, Pilate, wanting to gratify the crowd, released Barabbas to them, and he delivered Jesus after having him scourged to be crucified. So he loses his chess match, gets what credit he can, wants to satisfy the crowd, keeps order, keeps procuring revenue, but in the great scheme of things becomes one of the most famous bad guys in the history of the human race. The words "wanting to satisfy the crowd" are always a signal of danger. Pilate had no higher tribunal. We've remembered him ever since as crucified under Pontius Pilate. On this premise, however, Paul would have said to the Jerusalem crowd, "Sorry, my mistake," Martin Luther would never have said, "Here I stand," died of Worms. He continues, the way out of the snare is to pick another crowd. Here's a suggestion. Since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, that's a gallery worth playing to, and the noble living, that is, the noble living and the noble dead. Replace the lower wish with the higher. We must obey God rather than men. It's always easy to appeal to the immediate impact on the immediate audience, this commentator is saying there's a different audience, and we should always keep that one in mind. So Pilate has Jesus scourged. This is a ghastly form of torture. Mel Gibson's movie that I assume some of you, maybe all of you, have seen, The Passion of the Christ, depicts it pretty accurately. My only criticism is that it makes it such a centerpiece of the story that really it loses what the New Testament emphasizes, namely that that wasn't the worst of what Jesus went through. In fact, the gospel accounts are remarkably restrained in describing the punishments that Jesus went through, simply saying he was scourged. If we'd been there, it would have been almost unbelievably horrific to witness. But the gospel accounts don't want us to fixate on that, as bad as it was. We're supposed to understand that even that didn't really approach what Jesus was anticipating in his atoning labors. Pilate probably hoped this scourging would arouse a bit of pity, to no avail, and he hands him over to be crucified. And thus we have one of the most famous lines and famous images describing Jesus in all of human history. Peter stood up on the day of Pentecost, preached, saying in part, "Therefore let all the house of Israel know assuredly that God has made this Jesus whom you crucified, both Lord and Christ." The irony is that the symbol that stands for the most ugly and horrific form of persecution and death and torture and shame in history has become maybe the single most famous symbol in history. And how many churches have a cross on them? How many people in this room might be wearing a little cross around your necks? How much has that been transformed by the fact that it was at this moment that the greatest act of love that the world had ever seen took place? All right, well, Sunday school lesson number 1. A son of a father was freed, so the son of the father could stand in his place, opening the door for many sons to join the family. That's you and me, by the way. Hebrews chapter 2, it was fitting for him, for whom all things and by whom all things, in bringing many sons to glory, to make the captain of their salvation perfect through sufferings. Barabbas was a son of a father. We don't know the rest of his story. We don't know if he walked away from this chuckling under his breath that he really got away with one. We don't know if he actually took a second look, recognized what had happened. We certainly don't know if he might have had some kind of recognition of the much greater truth of what was going on here. It's pure speculation, but certainly if he didn't, he should have. He should have recognized the events that were unfolding, and as a result of that, embraced the truth of it. Pilate's question, "What evil has he done?" had no answer. The question, "What evil have we done?" creates a limitlessly long list. There is a striking contrast, my friends, between the sinlessness of Jesus, the robust righteousness of his person and his being, and us who, of course, fall unspeakably short of such a mark. He was wounded for our transgressions, Isaiah writes, not for his transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. So the chastisement of our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. Finally, Pilate played to a crowd hoping to gain his life, but he lost it. We must play to a different crowd, willing to lose our life in order to gain it. Again from Hebrews chapter 12, "Therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses," saints today, saints throughout history, watching the lives we live. There's the gallery to which we should be playing. "Let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that's set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Jesus went to the cross. Jesus stood in front of Pilate, in front of the Sanhedrin, in front of all of these, not protesting, not objecting, because of the joy set before him. And in his mind's eye, that joy was you. You. And so you have brought Jesus joy sufficient to warrant what he went through that day. Quite a thought, don't you think? Quite a thought.